All right, everyone, please welcome back for another appearance Fern Halper, our Vice President and Senior Director for Research with TDWI. She is going to be talking today about what's ahead for data and AI in 2026. We are covering this in conjunction with our upcoming virtual summit in December. We've already released a couple episodes around that as well. So this is another one in that list, and I'm very excited to see what Fern has in store for us in 2026, at least what she's seeing. Before we jump in, Fern, how are you doing? Where do we find you today?
I'm good. I'm in my home office in New York. How are you?
Perfect. I'm doing good. I am I'm under a lot of stress right now for the pending birth of my first child, so we'll see. And for those listening, there may be a slight gap in some releases for obvious reasons there with this podcast, but all things considered, I'm doing quite well. I'm also personally excited for what happens in 2026 for my own reasons in that sense, but let's stick to the topic at hand. And let me ask a very poignant question. I think it's a great place for us to start. Fern, what do you see ahead for AI specifically in 2026?
Okay, so I'll share a few things with you. Obviously, I don't want to give everything away because we'll be talking about this in the virtual summit. But the first thing I'll say is I do see that agentic AI systems, so by that I mean systems that operate autonomously to observe and reason and execute tasks within defined boundaries. Those are going to become more popular. So you think about a supply chain, manufacturing supply chain application. So that could use a number of agents to first maybe get data to supply the data, to supply the supply chain with data, clean it up, and alert if there are issues. But maybe the purpose of these multi-agent systems in this case is to report on what the best prices are or analyze some data to show that there's a problem, further down the supply chain, and then the agents have to deal with the logistics associated with the delivery of items because of the delays. But you can picture like a multi-agent system that could come together, in a supply chain, type of, you know, plan, transform, um, deliver, return, all of those steps that sort of go into a supply chain. So I think that agentic, and certainly I'm talking to a lot of organizations who are trying to start to think about agentic AI, and they're thinking about their processes and how they can use agents to actually automate some of their processes and workflows. And that's some of the first steps, the first use cases of that. So um, that's agentic AI is number one. So maybe not a surprise because we've been talking about it. But the second one is I think that AI governance is going to continue to push its way into the forefront, which I'm really happy about because I always think like governance has gotten a short shrift, in terms of data governance. And then as people were building AI, traditional AI models, they weren't necessarily thinking about governing them, which was a big mistake. But really now organizations, I think, are starting to realize that they have no choice, but to actually govern AI. And by that, I mean, not only those off the shelf consumerized applications that I think you and I have talked about before on this podcast, because we know that organizations are going to need to put guardrails on those. And I think we'll probably see some cases where companies actually lose their reputations, like, and incur penalties because they don't have the guardrails in
Hmm.
place. So I think if we don't see that in 2025, we're going to see it in 2026, sort of on par with, when the Weber, uh, the Bard chatbot said that the Weber telescope was talking about some question that a 9-year-old asked and it gave the wrong answer. And then Google's, shares went down significantly that day. I mean, I'm talking about like that type of scale of something where people
Hmm.
say, "Oh my God," like they actually uh, take notice. The Apple credit card thing where Apple put out a credit card and it turned out that women didn't get the same credit limits as men, even if they had more income, as their husbands, and they were sort of, like those types of things
Hmm.
where it makes the news, it's newsworthy. So I think that that sort of thing is we're going to hear about. But also, I think more organizations are now thinking that for generative AI with their company data, right? So I'm not just talking about, write some lines of code or do whatever, but actually using your company's data to build an application. And then obviously with agentic too. And then of course, for that 40% of companies that we survey that seem to have traditional AI, machine learning in place, it's hopefully going to become more important for them too. I think organizations are getting really aware of the risks of not having good governance in place, which I said I'm happy about. And then the third one that I'll talk about now, because I'll talk about others as well on the virtual summit, is that I think that companies that were using off the shelf consumerized tools are going to realize that that isn't enough. So I think that's going to send a sizable number of companies to start to pay more attention to their data foundations because they're going to want to use generative AI against their own company data. So, think about even a simple chatbot, or not so simple, but a chatbot. Well, the chatbot would would be a lot more sort of user friendly if it was personalized to the person that it was talking about. But for it to be personalized to the person it's talking about, it needs to be able to access the company data that the company has about that person. So those are three that I think we'll see in 2026.
Yeah. Those are all great, and I think you're spot on from everything that I've heard on my end here hosting this podcast. And I'm curious, I mean, you mentioned agentic AI a couple times there. Specific to agentic AI, what do you see happening, and what are some early signals that it will become more important in 2026? I know you might have just touched on some of those, but maybe you can expand for us.
Yeah. So first of all, I think I've been hearing a lot of vendor announcements around agentic AI. So it's coming from the vendor side, the large data warehouse vendors and data lakehouse vendors and data lake vendors and on and on. Everyone's talking about the agentic enterprise. They have different names for it, but
Hmm.
the agentic enterprise, we're hearing about agents that are data engineering agents, data science agents, and so on. So since every vendor is talking agentic now in 2025 and adoption typically lags, when the vendors start talking about it, I think that's one signal. Another signal is our research, because our research shows that the vast majority of organizations that we survey are planning to use generative AI. So 90% of them are, either experimenting with or using generative AI to improve their business performance and productivity. So interestingly, and this is like a semantic thing, a lot they already think that they're building agents, right? Because maybe they have an application and that's like a single agent. So they may be building an agent to classify issues and trouble tickets. So they're starting to think about agents now, right? So that's like a one agent agentic system, one agent multi-agent system. But um, we also see that 36 in a recent survey, we saw that 36% of respondents said that they're already experimenting or implementing agentic AI, right? So like back to that, maybe it's not multi-agent, but it's sort of single agent, but maybe they're thinking about agents. And about a quarter of the the companies that we surveyed said that they were building agentic AI applications. And as I mentioned before, anecdotally, I'm also hearing that about companies that are trying to build agentic applications. So they're looking at building them to automate a process. And what's interesting about that is that some of them are seeing that their processes aren't well defined. So, like, I was talking to a company that was um, talking about um, like holiday stores and help having agents help with that, but it wasn't like they really knew what their process was
Mm.
about putting up these stores in the first place. So they realized they had to go back to the drawing board. and understand their processes. So in some way, that's a good thing too, right?
Hmm.
Because they're going to be thinking more about their processes. So lots of signals out there that agentic AI is going to be continue to be popular next year.
Yeah, and you mentioned the AI governance piece, which obviously is super important. So let me ask, what do you see happening with AI governance when systems start acting independently, or as you mentioned, like collaborating with other agents? That seems pretty complicated.
I think it's complicated, and I
Yeah.
think it's it's going to be really interesting for governance. Organizations have a hard enough time with AI governance. Now there's going to be agentic governance. I think it's complex. And it's interesting because when I talk to companies now, a number of them are talking about their agents as employees. Not that they think that their agents are going to replace employees, but just in terms of the thought process, which is an interesting one. Like, what would be the governance that I need to put in place over my employees, when they're thinking about AI governance? Like, what
Hmm.
do I need to tell my employees? They're sort of taking some of what they would think that they would tell their employees and thinking about, well, what do I need to tell my agents, and what's going to be important to govern those those agents, because they could have 1,000 agents, and how are they going to put governance on them? And the first and most obvious that I'm hearing about is obviously with the access controls. So in some cases you want to build an agent. Well, in some software, I've heard stories that the agent actually inherits, like if you use an agent, if you want to go and use like one of these off the shelf tools to build an agent, that the agent will inherit whatever your permission levels are across your systems. Well, that's obviously not a good thing,
Mm.
right? You know, because who knows what they're going to do. So they could get at sensitive information. For example, if you have access to sensitive information, but really the app that you were building doesn't require sensitive information. So each agent is going to need to have specific access level permission associated with them. There's also lineage. So say you know how an agent, well, say you want to know how an agent arrived at a conclusion. So in other words, explain yourself, just as you would say to an individual, right? Explain yourself. So that means you're going to need to have some sort of history of how the agent did what it did to get to its action. And certainly, auditors may want to see that as well. I mean, those are just a couple of examples, but also agents are going to pass information to each other. So that has to be controlled. And in multi agent systems, there's going to be this orchestration agent or layer, like an orchestration layer that determines which agents are going to be used in a certain application and how they interact. And so, how do you make sure that the orchestrator is actually working
Hmm.
properly? Um, so, I think that there's a lot of people are starting to, not a lot, but I mean, people are starting to think about some of these things, which I think are obviously really, really important. So,
Right.
those are just a few examples, but I liked when I was hearing from people talking about, what would I think about my employee? Maybe I'm not stating it exactly as eloquently as they did, but you get my drift, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I have a quick follow-up there, because you mentioned earlier about newsworthy stories regarding, AI, agentic AI, and I can't help but remember the recent, I don't know if you want to call it an experiment or test that was done with all these large language models in which they were told that they were going to be replaced or turned off in a sense, and then they tried to prevent that from happening. I can imagine in a world where this sort of behavior from a large language model could potentially happen in these agentic AI worlds, where you have, if, like you just said, you could have 100, maybe 1,000 of these, AI agent employees, so to speak. What do you make of what do you make of that experiment, and how treacherous could this potentially be? Do you think that there is in congruence with this like AI governance piece? Do you think there's a way for us to monitor and control that sort of behavior?
yeah, I mean, that's what's going to have to happen. And we're going to have to go slow. And I think it's interesting because I was talking to a guy the other day who's been involved with AI since the 1970s. So he's basically seen it all, been everywhere, sort of been there, done that. And his view was that these agents, they're they're not as advanced as people really think that they are.
Mm,
And it was interesting to hear his perspective because even though everyone says they're going to be doing agentic AI, there's a lot of hurdles that they're going to have to overcome to, to do that. And, there is this lag between what the vendors are doing and even what they're doing. It's really exciting, but it's using, it's not everything is all that new, it's
mm,
just this, I guess, the scale of it. So I hadn't heard about the LLMs trying to save themselves. So that's very interesting. But I mean, each of those agents is, going to have to operate within defined parameters. And just like there's observability on AI systems now, there's going to have to be observability on each of those, agents, and the agents working together, and some sort of obviously human oversight to that. And I don't think that, at least in 2026, that the systems are going to be that multi-agent
hmm.
that hopefully people can keep an eye on what's what's going on. But I do think that, it's just going to take one for people to sort of say, whoa, slow down the reins, on this, I
Yeah.
think. And and you hear, right, on the news today, I heard AI is replacing all these jobs, and then a Yale study came out saying AI is not replacing all these jobs. So I just think it's there's a lot of information out there that
Right.
you got to sift through and try to figure out what's actually happening. And when I say that agentic is going to be big, I think organizations are going to start to think about it, but and put some small systems in place. But are we going to see 1,000 agent systems? I mean, maybe in some really advanced companies.
Hmm.
I don't, so, and they're going to have to lead the way in terms of what are the controls we're putting on these. I mean, I
Right.
think I myself, as much as I find it fascinating, also find it pretty scary. So, you think about those sci-fi movies, that
Right.
sci-fi shows that you saw from the 90s, where
Right.
people, someone would go to a planet, and then on that planet would be a culture that was, running these systems that were someone, 100 years before had developed, and they really have no idea how they're working. And all of a sudden, the thing is going to blow up.
Right.
And, you could picture a scenario like that down the road if we don't actually do things properly to, to start with. So,
Right. It really does feel like a new frontier, like a pioneering to an unknown, place. While it might not be physically or geographically located, it does really feel like these are, the first steps into this, very brand new world that we're into. So you mentioned earlier, though, that in 2026, organizations might realize that these off-the-shelf generic generative AI systems, cannot differentiate them in the ways that they might expect. Can you maybe expand on that a little bit deeper? Because that's pretty interesting.
yeah, yeah, sure. So if you think about different kinds of agentic applications, or even generative applications like a chatbot I was talking before, that would ultimately need company data. So if you have a support chatbot, the chatbot needs to know who it's talking to. And maybe that's not a differentiating application. But if you're in airlines, for instance, they're going to want to know, the agent should want to know, are they talking to, a platinum level person, or are they not, because personalization and customer service, is so important. So that's going to require company data. And I think that, um, as organizations try to innovate with AI, there's different kinds of innovation, right? There's just using the AI, that's not going to differentiate you. There's incremental innovations, which can start to differentiate you a little bit, based on what you do with the AI, and that's going to require your company data. And then obviously there's disruptive innovations, and I think that that's also for enterprises going to require, their company data also. So, I've mentioned this before. I think that companies are going to reach what I've been calling the value ceiling, with just these off the shelf tools or even building sort of ad hoc applications. So they're going to realize that they need to access their company data, and that is what's going to help them. But if they don't have their data foundation in place, then that's going to slow them down. So over the past couple of years since generative AI has hit the scene, what I've been seeing is that it's a higher priority in terms of investment than traditional AI, like machine learning. Yet that AI, the machine learning, when people implemented that, that actually helped with a bunch of learnings, not just around the data foundation, which organizations are building um, with their analytics application. So maybe they had some sort of data foundation in place, but in terms of putting models into production and governing them. And I think it also helped with responsible AI, right? Those cases besides the Weber one, when I was talking about the credit card one, I mean, that was plain old machine learning and, AI. So, but thinking about responsible AI, like, did anyone think about the bias and, the ethics of what was happening? I mean, they probably didn't test those models properly. But if they had learned some of those lessons, that may have helped them to get ahead with their generative and now agentic applications. I hope I'm making sense with this, but I think that some organizations never really took that path, and now they're trying to do, this new stuff. And how are they really gonna be able to differentiate themselves if they sort of can't get it, if they don't have those foundations in place? They're sort of operating sort of behind what's the sports analogy, Andrew, behind the batter's plate or whatever, if that
Sure.
makes sense. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah.
Like they're already sort of behind the eight ball, if that's what they want to, if that's what they want to do. So, and then again, I'm talking about enterprises and companies. I'm not talking about like companies that are creating, you know, some sort of therapy app or something like that. I'm talking about, you know, how you can get incremental innovations and impact, because that's what we're seeing in research that we just finished, is those companies that actually have an intentional strategy for innovation that includes their data foundation as the price of entry. Those are the ones who are going to actually get top or bottom line impact. So it's
Mm.
not just an ad hoc sort of strategy using off the shelf generative AI. So I feel like I've said that like 100 times already in the past 5 months, but I'm saying it again.
Well, I mean, obviously, 2026 is vastly approaching here as we're already in November, and I can see that you have had this kind of repetition in a lot of the, the talking points over the months. So maybe, 2026 is when most of this will be realized as you're talking about here. But Fern, I'm going to let you go, but I'm going to ask you one last question before I do that. I know we talked in the very beginning about the virtual summit that we have, what's ahead in data and AI for 2026. And I just wanted to ask, is there anything else that you're going to be bringing up during your session there in December?
It's going to be an interesting session because I'll talk about some of the, what I think is ahead for 2026. But part of my session is also a panel with the sponsors of the summit. So I'll get to talk to them about what they think about what I said, number one, and also what they obviously think is going to happen for 2026. So I think it'll be an interesting virtual summit. And then, of course, we have great speakers talking about agentic AI and RAG and um, some case studies. So I think it's going to be a really good summit.
Me too. I'm very excited for all of the sessions, including yours, and that panel discussion, which is going to be great. As a reminder for folks, I will go ahead and put the information in this description if you'd like to find out more about our virtual summit in December. Fern, thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure talking with you. I really appreciate you coming on again today to talk with me about what's ahead in 2026. Hopefully, we're all going to have a lot to talk about in 2026. I don't, I feel like it's not going to slow down anytime soon. But thank you so much for your time and have a good rest of your day.
You too. Thanks, Andrew.
To subscribe to the Speaking of Data podcast or to learn more about TDWI's research and training on all things data management and analytics, visit tdwi.org or click the link in the description below. Thanks for tuning in.